and understood how electricity is generated using solar panels. We've also understood the different market segments within the solar industry, residential, commercial, and utility scale. And we've also understood where solar fits within our own energy infrastructure, whether we live in an environment which doesn't have a strong grid and we use independent microgrids, or we live in North America where there's a strong electricity grid, so we use power purchase agreements and fit and compete with other forms of electricity. Regardless of where we are and how we operate, we want to start to understand from now on in this point in this course how the business of solar really works. And to do that, we can really understand four different areas of the solar industry. The first is financial. So how do we actually evaluate the power that's generated from the solar panel? What sort of business model does it go through? By understanding the financial, we'll understand how much the electricity is actually worth to the grid that we live in or the area we live in. We also want to understand the regulatory models. How do we make sure that we allow solar to be introduced across all the different market segments, residential, commercial, utility scale? How do we ensure that the solar is for everybody and not harming other forms of infrastructure that we've already introduced into our region? The next one is legal. How do we ensure to protect consumer rights and promote financing of solar arrays? And then finally, how does the solar generation adapt into existing grid infrastructure? Those four questions really highlight the business of solar and how it operates. By going through this section, once we understand the different business models, they'll cover each of these bases for us. So, what are business models? Well, we're going to go through what are the existing business models. We're going to talk about how they've evolved over time and where do we need them to promote faster adoption. We'll also look at regulatory models. The main regulatory model we're going to focus on is net metering. We'll also go through how net metering is changing globally. Within the business models, we understand that the business models must be set up. And for everybody's knowledge, we'll go through what business model means. Business model is really the mechanism or tool in which we use to sell that power, right? And we must set that business model appropriately. So, for example, if I'm selling cars, right? Now, whether I sell that car directly to a person or if I sell it to a company that then sells it to people, and the price I charge for it, that's the entire business model. So the means of getting access to the market and also the cost at which I sell it. So the business model for solar that we set up must be appropriate for easy adoption. Everybody must be able to utilize it. And the power must come at a cost that's equivalent or lower than the cost of electricity from other energy sources. Remember, we reviewed this previously, but essentially, the cost of the solar energy must be lower than all the other fuels in that area for it to be a good choice for consumers or even business owners. You don't want to pay for more expensive power through solar if you can buy it cheaper elsewhere. Unless you install the solar panels, generate the power, but you get additional incentives for generating that solar power. Those incentives could be carbon credits. In New Jersey, for example, they provide SREC credits. You could get tax incentives, which is really all across the United States. There are investment tax credits for installing solar panels. Or maybe you're okay with paying the higher cost of renewable energy because there's some marketing benefit in it for your business. Or you maybe have a personal choice that, I really want to pay more because I believe in clean renewable power. But really, there has to be a reason behind why you're paying more compared to other fuels. And I want to highlight this a little bit further, right? So if you remember, I posted the slide earlier in a previous section as well. And what that was really talking about, so this is from the National Renewables Energy Laboratory, and it's really the levelized cost of electricity, which is the total cost of electricity over the lifetime of the solar array. And so when we look at solar photovoltaic, it's higher. It's in between the 20 to 30 cent range, the spread, right? So now when we look at this, right, and we compare this to other fuels, we see that hydropower is cheaper, We see that geothermal is cheaper. We see wind offshore is cheaper. Wind onshore is cheaper. So, a handful of nuclear is significantly cheaper, almost 10 cents, right? So the reason becomes, how do you compete with the other fuels if this is at a higher cost? Well, you may be setting up your business model in such a way that you get an incentive, like as I mentioned, right, such as a tax credit or a carbon credit, which makes up for the difference in cost between solar versus any of the other fuels. That is the only way you'll be able to compete and convince somebody within your business model to take solar on. With that, let's start exploring the different business models. The first business model we're going to explore is the own and operate model. This is a fairly simple model, and essentially what happens here is that a homeowner or a business owner, what they do is that they end up getting solar panels installed on top of their business or beside their business or on top of their home or beside their home, and they actually own the system themselves. So the homeowner or the business owner owns the solar panels, they own the inverter, the racking, all the core components of the system, right? To assess if this business model is financially feasible, all we have to do is to calculate the total cost of all the different components and compare that to the annual electricity savings cost every year. So it's fairly simple. So we can do a simple IRR calculation and calculate that. Now this model, like I said previously, is fairly and most commonly used in the residential and small business market. To do an own and operate model, I should add, most of the times they hire an EPC company or a small developer. So somebody who's already doing this work, they'll be the ones installing from a homeowner. Most homeowners do not do it as a DIY project, as of not yet. Now, when we talk about the future of own and operate, this is becoming a more and more common model, especially in the Asias, in India, for example, where people are starting to buy solar systems and really own them. The reason why for them it's a worthwhile investment compared to North America is because the return on investment is higher. You get the power because you are able to generate a lot more electricity within those regions because of higher irradiance. You end up actually getting a payback on that solar array much faster, right? So some of the key reasons about the future of own and operate and the positives are there's energy independence, you can offset your own carbon footprint, and residential solar, it's starting to become kind of like purchasing an air conditioner. There's also going to be financing available for it. Now, some things about the own and operate model we have to think about is, what if you can't afford a solar array, or you live in an apartment building? Well, then you may not have space to put that solar array on. And the other one is the financing methodologies. We have to think about how to get the own and operate model to a point where it's kind of like going to Home Depot or going to a retail store and being able to just purchase the solar panels as if you're purchasing any other home hardware product. The second business model we'd like to discuss is the feed-in tariff contract. Now, feed-in tariff contracts were launched initially in Germany. They've been launched in Japan, Canada, some parts of the United States. And what happens within the feed-in tariff model is that a power purchaser, such as a regulatory body or a utility, set up a contract with a generator of renewable energy to purchase power at a fixed rate. What does that mean? Well, what happens is a regulatory body within your region, right? They say, hey, we'd like to promote solar within our province or our state. And to do that, what we're willing to do is we're willing to pay anybody who generates renewable energy within this region at a specific rate for pumping that electricity into the grid. So, if I were to go install solar within that region and connect it to the electric grid, the government would pay me continuously for as much energy I generated at a specific rate. Alright? So that fixed rate is dependent on that regulatory body wants to pay for renewable energy, and is usually set in a manner that allows for the acceleration of renewable energy development in that region. For example, in Ontario, when they started the feed-in tariff program, the contracts were paying originally up to 80 cents per kilowatt hour. They were slowly then decreased in price all the way down to 18 cents per kilowatt hour. The goal of a feed-in tariff is usually to start the subsidized rate high and then bring it down gradually until it hits the market rate of electricity. Correct. So you want to have a high subsidy, but then lower that subsidy to the point where it hits the market rate. That way you promote the development of solar within that region. And again, why do these regulatory bodies want to pay so much more for this power when they could, pick up power from a different fuel like hydropower or fossil fuels and get it for a cheaper cost? Because they realize that by subsidizing some of the solar power, it will push the technology ahead. So even though they have some part of their energy infrastructure coming from expensive solar contracts, in the long run it will be okay because due to the innovation, it will force the price down, right? Now, the contracts are offered on a limited time basis and are used to create jobs and drive the industry forward. Feed-in tariffs, as I mentioned, have been offered in California, New York States, and various parts of the US previously, and were originally started in Germany and Spain. Now, what's important to understand about the feed-in tariff is that they operate independently. So when you install a feed-in tariff installation, it gets a separate electric meter, and it goes directly into your grid. So there's no cap on how much power you can generate. Well, for the most part. There are some few exceptions on curtailment, but that's a long story that we can talk about another day. Moving onwards with feed-in tariffs, here's a little chart that kind of walks you through how the process of feed-in tariffs work. Okay? So the step one that happens is that people decide they want to make renewables a priority. So then the government sets a feed-in tariff, a long-term price, for anyone who wants to feed renewable energy into the supply. Utilities then allow access and pay the set price to anyone who can produce the renewable power. Then, incremental costs, so that subsidized rate, is actually passed on to the taxpayers and to consumers. Germany has achieved more than a 15% renewable power at a cost of about $2.50 per month per home. So really the taxpayer paid for this. Renewable systems are built all over the province as rates are not only reflect differently on technology costs, but also the quality of local resources. The prices are regularly reviewed for new projects and reduced to encourage technical innovation and reflect falling cost. Here's a little chart that shows really around the world globally where they've been tried and started off with feed-in tariffs. And often feed-in tariffs can lead and really start the way and then lead to other business models from there onwards. When we talk about the future of feed-in tariff, here's some great things. Feed-in tariffs are very easy to finance. Because they're backed by governments, it's easy to get financing for them. Usually what happens in feed-in tariff models is that solar developers go to land owners or go to rooftop owners and they lease the area from them. So they say, hey landowner, hey business owner, I'm going to lease that land for you at a certain cost, and I'm going to apply for a contract and install the solar panels there and generate the revenue from it. That's really the lease model. You can read up tons more about it on the internet, and we'll also leave some notes in our notes, some links in our notes, so you can read more on that model. But it's been very common in the United States and it's really expanded further from there. And the cons, though, is that because the cost of solar panels have been coming down so fast, and really, you can get utility scale solar sub 10 cents US globally, there is really not a real need for this anymore, right? So the innovations already happened. Also, because the contracts have a fixed value, usually governments will put a timeline of about 15 or 20 years for them. And solar panels and solar systems have a life of about 25 to 30 years. Really, there's a real question mark around how you evaluate the power generated from the solar panels after that contract ends. The other part is that they can have significant regulatory costs and impediments along the construction process. So because usually when feed-in tariffs are new and they're brought into the system, it can be challenging at times to really go through the construction process because everything is new. When you do a feed-in tariff regime in your country, the whole process is new. So there are a lot of impediments, but as you can see, the positive part about that is when you move into when solar's cost has dropped down and you're really competing with all the other market fuels, you've already set up the right processes and the right regulatory bodies for you to succeed. A power purchase agreement, or PPA, is a contract between two parties in which one generates the electricity, the seller, and one which is looking to purchase the electricity, the buyer. A feed-in tariff contract, which we spoke about in the previous section, is a type of power purchase agreement. The difference, though, is in a feed-in tariff contract, you specifically sold that power to the buyer of that power was always a regulatory or government body. Okay? The difference though now in a PPA is that it can be between any two parties, right? So it can be between me and Tom. And basically what me and Tom, the agreement we might have is I say, hey Tom, you're generating power and you're generating the power. So please tell me how long I can buy the power for, how much power I can buy, and how much is it going to cost me. So the power purchase agreement defines all of the commercial terms for the sale of electricity between the two parties, including when the project will begin commercial operation, the schedule for delivery of electricity, the penalties if they don't deliver that power, and payment terms and termination. A power purchase agreement is the principal agreement that defines the revenue and credit quality of the generating project, and is thus a key instrument of project finance. There are many forms of power purchase agreements in use today, and they vary accordingly to the needs of the buyer, seller, and financing counterparties. Okay, so I know this may sound complicated, but it's very simple. Essentially, it's party A buying power from party B. So let me give you an example of this. A very key example of this. Okay, so say I am an office manufacturing facility, and I manufacture cars within my manufacturing facility. Great. I have a high requirement for power. Okay. What I can then do is I can reach out to Tom's solar company, and Tom's solar company can say, great, you know what I'm going to do for you? I'm going to install solar panels on your roof. And then they're going to ask me, do you want to buy these solar panels? And I'm going to say, no, sorry, I'd rather invest in my core business. Why would I invest in solar panels? So I say, okay, great, no problem. Here's what we're going to do. As Tom's solar company, I will install these solar panels on top of your manufacturing facility. Great, okay. But in return, you have to sign an agreement with me that says you will buy the power at, let's say, 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Okay? At that price for 15 years. Great. And while you do that, right, I will set up the solar panels on top of your rooftop. I will pay for everything. I will manage them. I'll own and operate them. But you will buy that power from me during that time. I'll say, great, let's do it. Okay? Some of the things I'm going to think about during that, about the power purchase agreement, is what is the duration of the agreement? So 15 years, will I be in business for that long? Or if I'm a homeowner, am I going to own the home for that long? The other thing Tom is going to check about me is what's my credit rating? So Tom doesn't want to put solar panels on top of my business if I don't have good credit, because what if I go out of business after 4 or 5 years? Who's he going to sell his power to? Right? Remember, we're not putting this directly into the grid. We're putting this into somebody's business, right? So something you got to think about here is, are there net metering policies within that region? And we'll talk about that next, which is the regulatory tool. So what that tells us is what to do with the extra power we have if my manufacturing facility doesn't use it. The other thing in the power purchase agreement we have to think about is the escalator, which is really the increase in the cost. So say the power purchase started at 10 cents and I was buying the electricity at 10 cents. What happens in year 2 or in year 3 or year 4? How does that price increase, right? And also the minimum amount of power purchase. So how much do I have to purchase as a business? And also, maybe in 5 years I'd like to buy that solar panels that are on top of my roof. So what do I have to do to buy myself out of this power purchase agreement and own the equipment? So these are some considerations of power purchase agreements that we have to think about. A core example and a good case study on this is Google. Google has several power purchase agreements globally. They have about over 2 gigawatts of renewable energy projects, right? And they've got basically projects with Duke Energy, RES Americas, EDF. They've got wind power, solar power, and across the globe. And what they've done is they've basically said, hey, look, we're a big business, and we want to buy clean renewable power. So they've gone to solar developers. Sometimes they've given them their own land or their own rooftops. And sometimes they've just basically gone to them and say, hey, I'd like to purchase this power from you as clean renewable power. And with that, they're able to claim carbon credits and do a handful of other things. So Google's a really good example, and we'll certainly leave you some links within our notes so you can follow up and read about them. Furthering on, the model of the power purchase agreement kind of works like this, okay? It really requires 3 key players within that model. the developer, the host, and the utility. Okay? The developer is the person who coordinates the financing, design, construction of the PV system at the host's location. So in this case, Tom's company, they're the developer. Okay? They process all the incentives and they operate and monitor the PV system's performance. Okay? So they are basically the ones setting up the electricity and making sure it generates. So in kilowatt hours, that electricity is going to the host. The host receives the power from the PV site array. It goes into their electricity usage. Okay, so as a host, I have to make sure that power purchase agreement I signed, the cost I sign it at, is correct. I want to make sure it's not too high that I'm actually losing money compared to buying power from the grid, right? As a host, I need to decide how long is that PPA going to be, 10 years, 15, 25, right? And as a host, I'm going to pay the developer for the electricity that I utilize from that solar array. Okay? Now, if I have excess electricity as the host, that will get pumped in to the electricity grid. Who maintains that grid? The utility. So the utility continues to provide regular electric service. So let me just step back and say, when we go through a power purchase agreement and you're connected to the grid, it's not that you're not buying power from the grid anymore. You're still buying power. My business is still buying power from the grid. But some portion of that power is coming from the solar panels, right? And what the utility will then do is that power that I'm getting from the solar panels, they will credit that to me, to the host customer. So the money that I'm saving from the utility, because now I'm buying some, so let's say I'm buying my total electricity spend out of 100%, 25% of it is coming from solar, right? So then on my bill, my utility bill, I will get that 25% that I'm not saving as a credit, right? And that's really what I'm using. The money I'm saving from paying that utility is what I'm then using to pay the developer, right? So that's how the model works. There's lots you can read on power purchase agreement. Again, we will provide some more great content so you can really follow up and learn about power purchase agreements. Now, the future of power purchase agreements, well, power purchase agreements allow companies who do not specialize in solar generation to invest in solar energy. They're very popular, right? They're by far the most popular mechanism in commercial and utility scale for the deployment of solar. The challenge, though, is that what if I'm not a good business? I don't have a good credit rating. What if my business has only been around for a few years? I mean, the Apples, the Amazons, the Googles, they're all adapting it because they have great credit ratings, right? Well, what if I don't? So that's a real challenge that we're trying to address at the moment. And also, agreements can sometimes be too long. So, is the agreement 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? That may not be appropriate for a business, right? And also, power purchase agreements really work hand in hand with net metering. So net energy metering. And we're going to go over that in the next section. Net metering, or net energy metering, sometimes called NEM, allows consumers who generate some or all of their own electricity to use that electricity anytime instead of when it's generated. So net metering is a regulatory tool. It is a policy that has to be passed by your governing body. So if you live in a province or in a state, they have to pass that. Because what they're doing is they're telling utilities that, hey, listen, if this person generates too much electricity from the solar panels on their roof or in their backyard, and they cannot use that power, they can pump that into the grid, okay? And the grid will pay them back for it, okay? So, monthly net metering allows consumers to use solar power generated during the day at night. Well, how's that working? Well, look, if I generated 10 kilowatt hours extra during the day, and I got a credit for that when I generated it, then at night, when my solar panels are not generating, and I have that excess 10 kilowatt hour usage, I can use my credits from the day, right? Annual net metering rolls over net metering credit from the following month, allowing solar power that was generated in July to be used in December. So what that means is that if I'm generating tons in the summer, but I'm not generating as much in the winter, right? I can actually use some of my summer credits in the winter time. Most net metering caps are about 12 months. So utilities will allow you to keep rolling credits over, but for a maximum of 12 months. Because wind and solar power are non-dispatchable forms of energy, this is a great regulatory tool to enable this. And really, power purchase agreements are not possible without net metering. right? So if you do not have the ability to really sell this excess power into the grid and get a credit for it and really roll that power continuously, it's hard to do power purchase agreements. Net metering policies can vary significantly country by country, also by state or province. If net metering is available, we have to think about how long we can keep the credits. I spoke about 12 months. That's about the right time. The other question becomes is when you generate that electricity, what should you get paid for it? Should you get paid the retail rate of electricity, so what consumers see on their bills, or should you get the wholesale cost, which is what the utility gets or purchases that electricity for? So there are lots of questions revolving that and a lot of questions going around in the industry. Alright, so also just one last key point. Most net metering laws involve monthly rollovers of kilowatt hour credits. We spoke about that. But there is also a small connection fee, and they usually require monthly payments of deficits and annual settlements of any residual credits, right? So if my solar panel doesn't generate as much electricity as I thought it would, I still have to purchase that power from the utility, right? So you got to keep that in mind when you're doing net metering. Here's a diagram that walks through how net metering works. So essentially, as we learned in our previous section, sunlight shines on the solar panels. The solar panels then create the light into electricity. This goes in as DC power into our inverter. The inverter then converts this energy from DC to AC power. The energy is either used in our home, our school, or our business. And then any excess electricity that we have is then put into the grid by the way of a bidirectional meter. A bidirectional meter actually can calculate when energy is going into the grid and when we're pulling it out from the grid and going into the house. And so again, that green energy goes back into our grid. Now, if we don't end up producing excess energy, and say we're on a shortfall, then electricity from the grid will go into the house. So really, this house will always have power because it's connected to the grid, and so when the solar isn't producing, then the grid will provide that power. Now, the future of net metering, well, the great part is, the positives is that it allows consumers to decrease their dependence on the grid, right? The more and more power I generate from the sun right in where I need it, I require less from the grid. It can improve grid stability at times. Sometimes, in centralized grids specifically, we bring power in from very far away to our homes or businesses. And by having a rooftop array and a grid capturing that, we can reduce the losses from bringing that power from a far distance. So it can really help stabilize the grid. And also, net metering is truly the enabler of power purchase agreements and lots of other business models. Now, some of the cons, some of the things we have to think about is what should the value of the excess energy that generated be? Now, I brought this up previously as well, but how do you value that power generated? And also, what role do utilities have to play in net metering? So remember, utilities are responsible for bringing that power to your house or home, right? They really control the power grid, the lines, the electricity lines that bring that power to your house. So how come they have to pay you for this excess power that you're generating and putting back into the grid? So really, lots of questions around that, and there's tons of white papers you can read regarding utilities and net metering, and happy to leave some links about that as well in your notes.